Meeting of the Minds. Today I'm here with the great Father George Rutler, a living legend. Thank you for being with us, Father.
Glad to do it.
Okay, so I know that you know a lot about a lot of different things, and as a fellow Ivy Leaguer like myself, I'll just throw some topics at you. I'd love to hear your feedback.
Got it.
All right, so I guess first we'll start more basic with just what's going on now. COVID, the quarantine, the church closings. What are some of your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I think there's tremendous confusion. I mean, we get all kinds of signals in our culture. We sort of instinctively take advice from people who call themselves or are called by others scientists, but they seem to disagree. So, some say we should continue this lockdown, others say we should never have had a lockdown, others say it should be ended right now. Some say that we should wear these masks, others say no. So it's very difficult to discern. I think, the proof is in the pudding. You have to take a chance. It's a very hard call, because if you say open everything and then people get sick, you're to blame. And if you don't open everything and people suffer from that, you're also to blame. But there's one statistic that people seem to neglect, and that is the number of people who are psychologically affected.
Right.
I mean, there's even an increase in suicides and things. I'm not yet amongst them. As a matter of fact, I was rather surprised to see how fast days seem to go. That obviously is not the case with everybody, but I have a lot of things on my agenda I was hoping to accomplish, which I haven't done. It's simply because the day seems over before it begins. And also it provides a much needed repose, quiet, stillness. I had a note from a young father today who said that he has several children and they're having dinner every day together around the table and they're talking, and this is a novelty for them. He said it was like growing up in the old days.
Right, absolutely. And what about your thoughts on the church closings? I feel like everything closed pretty darn quickly.
Yes, which was stunning. I don't understand that. I know that there's a fear, again, about accountability if people come and there's a proliferation of this virus. But we have all kinds. We've always had flus and kinds of winter diseases, and we've handled them. It's a question of making people aware of that. I think people are sensible. But I don't understand at all why shops of all kinds of natures, malls can be opened and not the churches.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too. But it's interesting. We're in a funny time period.
Yes, and there's a kind of, shall we say, utilitarian view on the part of a lot of officials who rank church attendance at the bottom of the list. It's not as important as groceries or wine shops and things like that. So that reveals a kind of a misunderstanding of what the sacraments are, what the church is. I think it ironic that our president should be calling for immediate opening of the churches, and you have a lot of church leaders backing off. I think the president seems more Catholic than a lot of our own churchmen.
Right. I'm going to change gears on you a little bit here. You talk about combat sports. You with boxing, he is a wrestler. And then I think about ultimate fighting, mixed martial arts. How as Catholics should we view combat sports? In what sense? Maybe which ones are okay, which ones are not okay? Are they all bad? Are they all good? What would you say?
Well, they're not all good. I had a friend who recently went to California. He had never been there before. And, in California, of course, we generalize, but the sociological, psychological culture there tends to be rather mellow, laid back. And he was astonished. He said he really couldn't have a serious conversation with a lot of people because no matter what you said, they would respond, well, it's all good. Well, things aren't all good, not in this world. So when you talk about wrestling, boxing, mixed martial arts, you're talking about different entities. Now, I've written quite a bit on this. I think one of my books, I think it's, she spoke to us, I'm not sure.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I talk about boxing.
Yes.
And I was quite astonished a few years ago, you probably remember, there was a move to eliminate wrestling from the Olympics.
Right.
And yet they have ping pong and figure skating. So that's, I think that's a sign of the
effeminacy?
degeneracy of our culture. Wrestling, probably, is the oldest.
Right. Father?
It takes a lot of thinking. People don't realize that. I just was looking at some old videos of Gene Tunney.
Yeah.
1937, 38. He was a he introduced really more modern intellectual strategy in boxing with Jack Dempsey. These were very important figures. Now, I'm dead set against mixed martial arts because it's lacks skill. I know we'd be contradicted on that. But it's like in poetry. You have blank verse, and then you have free verse, and then you also, of course, have classical verse. But someone said that, I think it was Robert Frost, who was one of my teachers, as a matter of fact, quite a long time ago. He said that free verse is like playing tennis without a net. And free verse has no need for rhythm or even rhyme. And I think that mixed martial arts is the sports equivalent of free verse. It doesn't really require the skill that the boxing does. And besides the fact that it's very, very vicious, people forget that boxing is a very highly controlled sport. In fact, if you go down, I think most surveys indicate now, at least one I saw most recently confirming this, that amongst school sports and professional sports, boxing ranks 17th in physical danger. In fact, I think it was only a few years ago that I think one year in football, more cheerleaders were injured than football players in the NFL. So people generalize about these statistics, and they don't have the right picture. So I'm very keen on boxing. I don't do it. I'm not supposed to do it now. I had a couple of minor heart surgeries and heart stents, and I was told I could resume boxing. I could punch, but I could not be punched. And it's very hard to find an opponent who will agree to that protocol.
Other than Paul the punching bag.
Yes, exactly.
Father, now, but instead of maybe looking at it, though, through the lens of what requires the skill, should we be looking at it in terms of what's the intention? Like when you're punching someone, you're trying to hurt them. Now, I think, like, okay, wrestling is different. You're trying to pin them. But boxing or mixed martial arts, you're actually trying to hit them as hard as you possibly can and knock them out. I get it. There's a difference between doing it with a glove on, a big padded glove, versus almost just your knuckles. Should we be looking at it that way or no?
Well, historically, opposition to boxing was rooted in precisely what you said, bare knuckle boxing. They didn't even have gloves. And when they instituted gloves, 3-ounce gloves, you might as well not have had gloves at all. And it's quite, when you look at Jim Johnson and thee people, 100 years ago, I mean, they would go over 50 rounds, bare knuckles. It's absolutely amazing. And they were sanguinous, bloody, but not only is it a matter of attack, it's also a matter of defense. So it's very good training for life. And the protocols in boxing are such that there is a great respect for the opponent, despite all the drama. And by the way, I don't include professional wrestling, which I think is absurd. But there's a chivalry in that. Now, recently I've started fencing lessons, and I've always wanted to do that. And I guess now maybe it's incipient senility or something, which inspired me to start this. And it's this very elegant sport, and of course you're much more protected than you are in boxing. But there is a chivalry in that sport, which I think recommends it.
Okay. It seems like a lot of times now, because we're drilled with that professional wrestling mentality, there's a lot of trash talking.
Yes, that's awful. Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to change gears on you again. Now thinking about history. Republic versus the monarchy. Have we been lied to in our history classes?
Well, one risks the danger of nostalgia in discussing governments of the old days. The old saying is that nostalgia is history after a few drinks. You remember, if you're well disposed, you remember the good parts, not the bad parts. When you talk about monarchy, you remember the great kings. I'm working now on a little book on St. Louis IX, who was one of the great kings of all history, a real saint. So you can be a government leader and holy, but we also know the downside. But that's the problem with every kind of government. You know, Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. You're never in a fallen world going to have a perfect kind of government. You need constraints. The question is, you know, who decides on those constraints? There's always the danger of abusing them. I think one advantage of a monarchy is that the monarch has done nothing for the job. He just gets born. And that rather reminds us of the dignity of life, you know, honoring birth. Now, that may sound ridiculous, but you grow into that office, but the office is there not because you've been, you know, competing against other people, but simply because you are alive. The risk, of course, is that you can abuse your office, as has been done. So there's no perfect form. We're very blessed in the United States with our Constitution, with our form of government, which is the envy of the world. Our Constitution is just a few pages. The Constitution of the European Union is 1,000 pages, and it's like a swimmer. The better the swimmer, the fewer strokes you make. If somebody's splashing in the water, he's drowning. Now, the European Union had lost its cultural fundaments. The original inspiration for the European Union came from very serious, altruistic Catholics. We have de Gaulle, de Gasperi, Adenauer. These people envisioned a Christendom in the best order, but without that cultural root in piety, you just get a bureaucracy. We know that bureaucracy is always deadly.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been learning a lot more about the monarchy and about history, and how a lot of history that we've been taught in school is not necessarily how it took place.
Well, that's usually the case. You know, Churchill said that history would be very kind to him because he intended to write it. It's the victor writes the history, then the critics move in. But it's often been remarked that we were fortunate that George Washington had no children, because the temptation then would have been to have an hereditary presidency, which would be a monarchy but not in name. When Benjamin West, who was an American from Philadelphia, an artist. He was court artist to King George III. At the end of the Revolutionary War, he told the king that George Washington had spurned the crown and had gone back to his plantation. Well, George III loved farming. He liked raising pigs. He was a very basic, simple, kind man. I'm very well disposed towards George III. Every July 4th, I write a tribute to him. He said to Benjamin West, "If that is the case, sir, George Washington is the greatest man in the world." And George Washington then set the model. And there's always a temptation, of course, to lapse into dynasties, for good or ill, but usually for ill. In our republic, we're a republic, we have to remember, technically we're not a democracy. We're a republic because people choose electors than who choose their leader. But we've had proto-dynasties. The Adams, of course, his father's son, president. The Harrisons, Roosevelt, Kennedy's, Bush's. No, there's certain advantages in that because people have grown up in an environment in which they know how to deal with situations that other people are unfamiliar with. But that's also the justification for hereditary monarchy. It always astonishes me that with the hundreds and hundreds of million people in our country, we come up with the officials we do come up with. But that's the nature of any kind of, any kind of bureaucracy. That's true in the church.
Yeah, it's true. All right, another.
But I always like people agreeing with me.
Yes, I'm on your side, Father. my next thought or question was about the Holy Mass. Now, I've been to your Mass. Some would describe it as the unicorn, right? The most reverent Novus Ordo Mass. Can you talk about that? The Novus Ordo versus the Tridentine Mass. Do you celebrate the Tridentine Mass? What's your opinion on all that?
Well, again, we have to be very careful with our terminology. When we speak of the Tridentine Mass, that's an unofficial term because that's the Mass existed as in the form that we call Tridentine Mass long before,
right?
Council of Trent. So it's basic now. It's called the extraordinary form. I would just call it the traditional form. And during this lockdown, I've been using the traditional form every day. And I've, come to, I've done it many times, but doing it constantly has reminded me, first of all, of the great treasure, the historic treasure that's there, the cultural treasure that's there, and how much we have lost, how radical, well, we would call it reform, but I would call it disruption in the liturgical tradition. My great liturgical hero is Pope Benedict XVI, and he's been very clear on how radical the change was and unjustified it was. It really wasn't a adaptation; it was a replacement, and that I think is very unfortunate. At the time, in the 1960s, when the changes were coming up, a long list of well-known cultural groups sent a petition to Pope Paul VI. One of them was this detective writer, Agatha Christie. So it's called the Agatha Christie petition. And the Pope did see it, and apparently he was a fan of Agatha Christie's detectives, and that impressed him. So he gave an indult to the Catholic Church in England to use the old form, because at that time, the indication was that the old form was totally suppressed. But nothing much came of that at the time. But the point here is that so many of those signatories, maybe most of them, were not Catholic. You had Agatha Christie. You had poets. I think T.S. Eliot. No, it was after T.S. Eliot died. But you had musicians. Yehudi Menuhin, who's Jewish. Right? What was their point? Their point was that the historic Mass had been the backbone of Western civilization. All our art, all our poetry, our philosophy, our theology refers to that form and to that language. And they knew, even not from a non-Catholic point of view, that to imperil that would be to imperil the whole psychology of Western civilization. So I think we have much to learn. Now, I also, by saying the Old Mass, I see what little, it should have been retooled, little bits, and the calendar and so on, updated. But I've come to realize that we've lost so much, and there was a terrible arrogance in just quickly chucking out this worship, which had, had been, somebody in the 4th century would have understood what you're saying there. So when you're at the altar, you talk about the angels, the archangels, the whole company of heaven. You're talking about all our ancestors as well. It's very moving to know that any of them could come into the church and recognize what you are doing. And with a very careful prescription and rubrics, even to the point of telling the priest how to hold his hands and all that, you avoid the abuses that we have sadly seen in the Novus Ordo. Now, of course, there were abuses in the old use as well, the priests mumbling through and all that, but nothing like what we have now.
Right, and as you said about replacement, things being replaced, I've read a lot of the papal encyclicals recently, from Gregory the 16th to Pius the 12th, and it seems like they're very anti-modernism, very anti-liberalism, and then we see Vatican II, and I've been really trying to make sense of, well, then how do we view the information from Vatican II in light of this tradition that came almost immediately before then? What would your recommendation be? Is it continuous, or I know it's a big question?
What continuous? The liturgy or doctrine?
Just the teachings of the church.
Yeah. Well, the essential teachings of the church are constant. That's not changed. And people have to realize that a council or a pope has no authority to renounce the essential dogmas of the faith. Cardinal Newman, now Saint John Henry Newman. So we must remember that the office of the papacy is primarily negative. And he's a negative in the positive sense that the job of the Pope is just to, rein in the truth, protecting it from error, but not inventing truths, because there are no truths. The Second Vatican Council, I think, happened at a very dramatic time in history, but it was an unfortunate time to have a council because the culture had begun to absorb an arrogance, thinking that man had finally come of age and that we knew more than anybody knew before. Well, we certainly knew a lot more about technology, but psychology never changes. Human nature never changes. I would want to have the 13th century architect, but I wouldn't want a 13th century dentist. So you have to appreciate that the development of doctrine, as Newman said, preserves type. It adjusts to the culture of the age, not by in any way muting the truth, but finding new ways to express that truth. But it doesn't replace the truth. We're only, like biologically, men and women are procreators, they're not creators. And in the liturgy and in the doctrine, we don't create these truths or these forms of worship. So there was an arrogance at the time of the Second Vatican Council, as if we had to restate or replace attitudes of the past. There were some, in the human scale of things, yes. There were terrible mistakes made in Christian history, one way or another, in human relations, attitudes towards religion, the religions. But the greatest threat to civilization at the time of the Second Vatican Council was Marxism. And the Council never once mentioned Marxism. I mean, it'd be like during our pandemic never mentioning the virus. Looking back, of course, that was an embarrassment. And I think as far as the prophetic office of the church went, the church dropped the ball at the council. Well, councils come and go, but the documents of the Second Vatican Council have more words than all the other extant documents of all the other councils combined. And that wordiness, I think, indicates a certain arrogance.
Yeah.
I'm not in any way saying that was invalid. There are very important things in the council, but I think it was a lost opportunity. And it also opened the door for many misinterpretations. If we follow, for instance, the council on worship, on the liturgy, the liturgy would be much more like the old form. Fathers of the council, most of them, had no idea what was going to be done in the name of the council unjustly. Now, we've been blessed with some popes who were saints. John Paul II was very much involved in the documentation of the council, especially Gaudium et Spes, which I think was rather a flawed document. But he based much of his own understanding of Christian anthropology on the council. So the council there made an important contribution. Cardinal Ratzinger, who was a peritus at the council, an advisor, was rather experimental. And I guess he would have been considered a little more freewheeling than many of the periti there. But he learned very quickly, as a humble man, that there were good things done at the council, but also mistakes made. And I think his entire life after that was to remedy those mistakes.
Yeah, and it seems like with 2 points in the council, it seems like before Vatican II, we were not allowed to pray with non-Christians at all. And number 2, it seems that we didn't call Protestants or Orthodox Christians or part of the church. It seems like after that, then they were taken on the term of Christian. And it seems like we then opened the door to pray with other faiths, even though the council didn't explicitly say it. Go ahead.
Yes and no. I mean, the church has always said the one is Christian by baptism. And the church has always recognized the validity of baptisms using the formula, the Trinitarian formula, certainly amongst the Orthodox, and to usually amongst the Protestants, unless they willfully denied baptismal regeneration. Sometimes, if there was a doubt about that, there would be a conditional baptism. But the church has always recognized the validity of the holy orders of the Orthodox Church. So I think the council did make a contribution in saying that the Holy Spirit, as we're told, blows and lists where he will, and the Holy Spirit can inspire people outside the church into some understanding of the truth. But we have to be very careful when we say there's no salvation outside the church. what that formula really means is not that if you're damned for eternity if you're not a member of the Catholic Church. What it's saying is that if by God's grace someone that comes close to the truth, wills to do the truth, in the last judgment, if one can receive the grace of the Church and be given eternal life. So to say no salvation outside the Church really means if you're going to be saved, and that's up to God. We don't make that final judgment. It's not a question of being outside physically the Church. It's a question of being with or without the Church. So if somebody not a Catholic finally comes to accept faith, that cannot be done without the help of the Church. That's an important distinction. In fact, we had that case with Father Feeney in the 1940s, who took a very fundamentalist, well, I wouldn't say fundamentalist because he was wrong, literal interpretation of that, and was accused of, was excommunicated for heresy by Pius XII.
Wow. Okay. And then if I may, just one final question about music. When I visited you, I saw a lot of, the piano. It's talking about the great medieval hymns. How important is music for us to edify our soul? And then also, how has it gotten derailed over the years? Gone off the tracks?
Well, yesterday I went to a Memorial Day barbecue, and someone had a loudspeaker and with some sounds coming out. I hardly could call it music. I said, "Did you put that on deliberately?" So we live in a culture in which there is a cacophony, noise can pass music. If you read, the Greek philosopher Plato, his ideal republic, he describes what music is and how a civilization identifies itself largely by its music. And he bans from the ideal republic, which is a kind of utopian place, what I think by his description we would call rock music, or certainly rap music. And why? Because music is supposed to take you into the ethereal realms as the highest order of created harmony. That's why music of all of the arts is the highest. It's higher than painting, higher than sculpture, and his point was that when music turns in on itself, it becomes barbaric. If it just repeats the bodily rhythms, it excites the lower passions. And if the words are destructive, it has a destructive effect on the soul. Now, this sounds kind of abstract and fancy, but it's good psychology. And the Church is supposed to be the head of all, the teacher of civilization in the arts. The Church is not faithful to her evangelical commission if she does not cultivate great arts. We've lost a sense of that to a degree. Instead of transforming culture has transformed the Church in many places. And we get trash music at church now, which is awful. I wrote a book on hymns. I highly recommend it, which I talk about this. It helps to know the history of the composers of these hymns, why they wrote what they did. But after the Second Vatican Council, we got dreadful music, and much of it just man-centered and sentimental. Sentimentality is the enemy of love, because sentimentality is love without an object. It's an attempt to love without sacrifice. And that was the psychology of much of the music that came after the council. Is, people would say, well, give the church a little space, a little time. Every council has been followed by a period of confusion. Well, all right, but we're 50, 60 years after the council, and what's happened? And where are the arts? The council has not inspired any great art.
Father, are there any good old books that you'd recommend to help us get back to the musical tradition and the artistic tradition of the church?
Well, we can read a lot. It's like, well, all art, to be honest and true, has to be moved by love. It's as simple as that. As St. Paul says, without love, we become a clanging cymbal. Well, if we don't love, our paintings will be abstract nonsense, and our music will just be noise. And that's the case. So we can read a lot about it, and I think we've maybe overemphasized the need for marital preparation. This is putting a cat amongst the pigeons here, but all right, in our culture, there's such an ignorance about what marriage is that we do need instruction. We have to tell young couples what the church expects of them. However, you're not going to learn it from a book. If people are going to learn what true marriage is, they have to look at happy marriages. We have a lot of young people today whose parents have not had happy marriages, and that's affected their understanding or their fear. I think that's one reason why young couples are hesitant to marry. But it's the example. It's not reading about love, but it's seeing love. Is that change? And that's the same thing with music, hearing it, real art, seeing it. And children are born out of love, and a child has an instinct to beauty. It has to be trained in how to refine that beauty, but children understand that. And I think that's true in worship, in the liturgy. A friend of mine brought his little girl just once in a while to our church, where we have very simple music. I mean, we don't have a fancy choir or anything. We do basic chant. That's all you need. Nice if we could afford more, but he also took her to another church, and the little girl, maybe she was about 8 years old, was scandalized because the people were clapping. They clapped after the mass, and they clapped for the ushers, what goes on. And she said to her father afterwards, she didn't want to go to that church anymore because the people clapped, and you're not supposed to clap in church. So no one taught that child that. A child has an instinct for worship, real worship. Now, the barbarians had an instinct for worship too. They worshipped trees, they worshipped false gods. They had to be taught the true God. But there was that instinct of worship. And without that instinct, without cultivating that instinct, we're not going to have great music. We're not going to have a great art. If you want to know, for instance, what a real church should look like, ask a bride where she wants to get married. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, so many terrible churches, the ugly churches, were built. And why? Because that's what the young people wanted. The architect said. No, it's what the architect wanted. He wanted to make a mark, be distinctive. And it backfired. No bride wants to get married in a church that looks like a spaceship. We are now seeing a revival of the classic arts. We have a lot of, I deal with a lot of young young artists. And there is this very, very real revival in classical training, in the plastic arts and in music. But the switching points in the art world now still are controlled by the deconstructionists or the modern artists. So it's very hard for the classically trained artists to get a toehold, but they have their foot in the door. And for a generation now, we're going to see a mega shift. But I think a lot of our clergy have been mistaken this way. They don't understand what's going on, and they're very threatened by the fact that young people are looking for something transcendent that had been neglected. I had a group of young people in my parish, well, during the lockdown. They all kinds of professions and all that, very bright young people. And I asked them, I can say which use you want. No, they wanted the traditional form. They wanted the Latin. And you can say, well, they don't know Latin. Well, all right, the child doesn't know English until it's taught that. And why don't they know Latin? Because the church was remiss. I've heard of bishops saying, well, the problem is if we can use the old form, but we don't have any priests who know the Latin anymore. Well, the church required officially that seminarians learn Latin. Well, why weren't they? That was this act of disobedience. So one should never boast about one's ignorance. Because to be ignorant doesn't mean you're stupid. To be stupid means you're incapable of knowing something. To be ignorant means you just don't know anything. I mean, I had a hard time setting this Skype thing up today. I'm ignorant of that kind of technology, but that doesn't mean I'm totally stupid. But what amused me these last few weeks is that these people would come, younger people would come to the traditional mass with their iPhones. And there are apps now you can follow the old mass on this. So here you have, the best of the old and new. They don't bring their leather-bound missals now, but they bring their little things. First time I saw that, I was offended. Well, I walked into our side chapel, and there was a fellow there looking at his iPhone. And I thought that, this was irreverent, but then I realized he was following prayers on it. In my old church, there was a fellow kneeling at our St. Joseph's shrine, and he was looking at his machine. And I thought, well, So when he got done, I rather sarcastically said to him, I hope St. Joseph was on the other line. Well, in that case, he was talking on the phone, That's an abuse and a distraction. It's a problem we have right now, though, in the matter of prayer, in the matter of worship, short attention spans. And people are nervous, quiet. I mean, I've seen people in restaurants, even at home, around the table. They'll be talking at the same time they'll be texting. It's called tasking. Well, you can't do that when you're talking to God, because we'll have distractions in a fallen world. But you don't create those. You mustn't create those distractions.
Absolutely. I think we are seeing that revival, and I hope we continue moving in that direction. Father Rutler, thank you very much for answering all the questions. I know we spoke about a wide variety of topics. I was very excited to get your opinion, so thank you. And if you would please be so kind to give myself and our viewers a blessing.
The peace of God that passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. The blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, Holy Spirit be upon you now and remain with you always. Amen.
And thank you very much, Father. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Take care.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.